He's a correspondent over at GZERO Media. You can read also the GZERO Media Daily, the newsletter that he does, that I get all my information from, which is why I reached out to him in real time. I texted him 2 days ago. I said, you need to come on the show and explain everything that happened in Russia, this coup d'etat that never happened. And that's Alex Kliment. Alex, Mike, and Nick, thank you so much for hopping back on the podcast with us.
Great to be with you guys again, as always.
Yeah. Alex, you know, I want to start just at a high level, because I know for me, I want to speak in actualities here. When I saw this break, I understood that there were private military groups that Russia employed, but I didn't know to like what degree, or like, I don't know, you know, the troop capabilities of some of these private military groups. And then I start hearing more of the news about this group marching to Moscow, a couple cities that they took along the way, no bullets fired at all. And then all of a sudden, within 24 hours, this all fizzles out. Can you give our audience a 30,000-foot overview of what happened last weekend and the particulars around it, and why it made news and then all of a sudden came and went without like any guns drawn, bullets fired? What's the latest?
Yeah, I mean, in fairness, even for those of us who have followed Russia for a long, long time, there were a lot of ups and downs and surprises last weekend. So let me just start with the biggest picture, as you say. Yevgeny Prigozhin is a guy in Russia who is a ex-convict who built a catering business that was Vladimir Putin's preferred catering business in St. Petersburg. He built that and parlayed it into a large kind of state contracting company of all sorts over the years, which ended up moving into the military contracting sphere and ultimately creating his own private army called Wagner Group, or Wagner Group. The purpose of Wagner Group was a couple of different things. One was to send mercenaries to countries in Africa and the Middle East, Syria in particular, to help the Russian government solve problems that were hard for it to solve using the conventional military or conventional police or conventional spies, right? So Vladimir Putin basically aids this guy, Yevgeny Prigozhin, in creating a private military company that is basically dictator services unlimited for whatever client states the Russians are working with. And they send a lot of guys to Africa to help various dictators spy on their opponents and wage wars and keep security, in exchange for which the Russians get access to all the minerals and natural resources in these countries. In Syria, Wagner Group was very useful to the Russians in a way that the military wasn't, because a private military company gives you certain advantages, right? It's plausible deniability if things go wrong, but it's a lot of flexibility if things go right. So Putin really started to use this guy for a lot of stuff. In 2016, when he wanted to meddle in the US election, who was the guy he called up and said, hey, could you please start a troll farm that would go meddle in the US election? Yevgeny Prigozhin says, yes, sir, I'm on it. I'll do it. So this guy, Yevgeny Prigozhin, who I'm going to get to about what he did last weekend, kind of emerged over the past 10 years as a very shady kind of Mr. Fix-It for Vladimir Putin. He has this large private army that does stuff in Africa, does stuff in Syria. And when the Ukraine war started, actually the first time it started in 2014, Vladimir Putin called him up again and said, hey, we would like a little extra help in Eastern Ukraine fighting this war. So in 2014, they start operating a little bit in Eastern Ukraine, but it really takes off after last year, when this guy, Yevgeny Prigozhin, basically leads an army of 25,000 guys in Eastern Ukraine, which into some of the most brutal fights that we've seen over the last year, and ends up doing pretty well. And so over time, what happens is this guy starts to get a little bit heady, right? He starts to think, well, I've got a lot of juice with the Kremlin. I've got a lot of juice with the Ministry of Defense. These guys, the war is going badly, but we're doing well. So he starts to get into an ongoing argument and criticism of the Ministry of Defense itself, right? So he starts criticizing the actual Russian army, saying these guys are a bunch of scumbags, and the generals who control the army, by the way, not the actual soldiers themselves. He starts saying, look, these guys who are running this up, you want to know why we're doing so badly in Ukraine? It's because these guys in the Ministry of Defense are a bunch of corrupt, elitist, aloof scumbags who are more interested in lining their pockets than in prosecuting this war properly, right? So Vladimir Putin's looking at this and says, okay, this is my guy, my Mr. Fix-It, and he is like openly beefing with my Minister of Defense, criticizing him, saying he's an idiot, saying he's stupid. Putin lets this go on for a little while, but finally it gets to be too much, and so Putin says, you know what? I'm sorry, I'm going to have to subordinate Wagner Group to the actual army because I can't have this clashing going on anymore. And that, in my view, is the proximate cause of what happened last weekend when Prigozhin realizes he's about to lose this autonomy that he's had, running around being a warlord in the east of Ukraine, and decides to make a big show of force to basically convince Putin that he shouldn't have to be subordinated to these scumbag clowns in the Ministry of Defense, and that he's really his own man, has got his own juice. So what he does is he takes his 25,000 guys who've just been rotated off the front line in Ukraine, and he leads them on what he calls a march of justice to Moscow. And along that march to justice, his guys end up taking, without a shot, a large city in southern Russia called Rostov-on-Don, which is right across the border from Ukraine. It's the major logistical hub for all of Russia's war in Ukraine. He takes that city without a shot fired and starts moving north towards Moscow, which is about 600 miles away. Takes another large city called Voronezh. Maybe your listeners will know it, maybe they won't, but it's a city of 1 million people halfway to Moscow, and then keeps going. And what happens, and it looks like this is an armed insurrection. Is this a coup? Is it a mutiny? Is it an insurrection? I would say it's a mutiny rather than a coup, because he wasn't actually, what he said what he was trying to do is he wasn't trying to overthrow Putin. He was basically trying to scare Putin into either changing out the Minister of Defense or letting Wagner Group continue to operate on its own. So this looks like it's getting really, really bad on Friday afternoon, Saturday afternoon. And then all of a sudden it stops. And it sounds like there's a deal that's been reached. And Prigozhin says, I am ready to turn around and take my guys back to their barracks because I don't want to spill any Russian blood. If this goes on any further, there's going to be a real bloodbath. So there's this weird thing where he takes his guys home. The deal that the Kremlin says was reached is, okay, we're not going to prosecute you for treason, but we are going to insist that you leave the country with your guys and go off to Belarus. We're going to be put out to pasture in Belarus, right? Country next to Russia, close relations, basically a client state of the Russians. And this kind of leaves everybody thinking, who won, who lost, why did this happen? And where we are over the past day is that a lot of the Wagner troops who participated in the rebellion have gone back to their barracks. Putin came out today and said, this guy is still a traitor, but you Wagner guys, you're welcome to join the regular army or go home or go to Belarus. And everyone's kind of wondering what's the next shoe to drop. This has been the most significant challenge to Vladimir Putin's power in the history of his time as president, which is a long history, as you probably know, more than 20 years. And it's sort of unprecedented for a warlord to lead, several thousand guys towards Moscow, if not directly to threaten the Kremlin or threaten the president, at least to try to force him to make a decision about how he runs his army. And now we're kind of left wondering, who won, who lost? Is this the beginning of the end for Putin? Is Prigozhin going to be killed in the next couple of days? These are all the questions that are floating around. But the basic story is a Mr. Fix-It who Vladimir Putin created 10 years ago got more powerful than he thought he would and ended up turning on the government and turning on Putin in a lot of ways.
Alex, as we're talking before, and first off, to our listeners, you're not going to get that story the way it was just told, which essentially sounds like the plot to a Metal Gear game, as well as Alex just presented it. So first and foremost, shout out to him and shout out to Hideo Kojima.
It's Metal Gear crossed with The Godfather.
It's just wild. We're a baker.
Yeah.
Patty cake bakers, man, indeed. Yeah. Alex, though, as we're talking about private military companies, what is the history with Putin in terms of, because this was new to me about a PMC being just widely used and partnering with the Russian military, though it makes sense. But what is the relationship that Russia has with PMCs? Is this a prevalent tactic that they have, or is Wagner really what stands out in terms of the way private military organizations work with the Russian government?
It's a really good question. The Wagner Group, which is part of a larger thing called Concord Group, All of these names are so like dystopian and Orwellian. But in any event, it's by far the largest private military company and the largest sort of purveyor of, dictator plus services to the Russian government and its client states. But the phenomenon of Vladimir Putin relying on kind of extra sort of paramilitary organizations or organizations that fall outside of the conventional security apparatus in Russia is not new. The other big example of it is in Chechnya, which is a republic of Russia, which waged several unsuccessful wars for independence in the 1990s, which were ultimately crushed by Vladimir Putin, who then installed or I would say co-opted a local warlord named Ramzan Kadyrov to basically run the place and keep it quiet on behalf of the Kremlin, in exchange for which Ramzan Kadyrov, leader of Chechnya, basically gets his own basically private army of 10,000 guys, which he also has used on behalf of Russia in Ukraine. So when we talk the answer to your question is, there are not a huge number of large private military companies like Wagner Group. Wagner Group is by far the largest in terms of the kinds of things that it does and the numbers of men under arms. But the phenomenon of Vladimir Putin using structures that fall outside of the army and security services is not new. And in Ukraine, that became doubly important for him when it became clear very early on that the conventional army was not doing a great job, right? The army was supposed to take Kyiv in 3 or 4 days. And the idea was that local turncoats all across Ukraine would fold within 72 hours and basically cut deals with the Russian government in order to avoid bloodshed. That was obviously completely, totally wrong. Here we are a year later, the Ukrainians are still fighting their asses off. But it very quickly became a problem because the Russian army didn't really have the tactical or logistical capabilities to prosecute this war effectively. So Putin, again, calls up his private military guys, say, listen, can you give me a hand in some of these key battles? And they sent them into, maybe you and your listeners followed a little bit of there was a battle for a strategic city in eastern Ukraine called Bakhmut, which went on for several months. It was an absolutely horrific, a horrific meat grinder of a battle. Wagner Group were the guys who were in the heart of that fight and ended up winning this tremendously Pyrrhic, but victory to conquer Bakhmut. And that's when this guy Prigozhin really started to get annoyed with the Russian army itself. Because he relies on them for a lot of his supply lines, and Russian army supply lines and logistics in this war in particular are famously horrible. So he's out there, his guys are getting slaughtered by the dozens. His guys are not great guys, by the way. I'll tell you a little bit more about who they are in a second. But his guys are getting slaughtered by the hundreds, thousands even, and he starts to accuse the Russian army of deliberately cutting him off from supplies because they realize that his guys are fighting better than their guys are and they want to clip his wings. That's how this whole thing really starts until it escalates into this bigger confrontation.
This episode of the Can We Please Talk podcast is presented by the good folks over at Razoo. Razoo is a brand new networking and collaborating service for artists in the music industry, providing music creators the collaborative tools to create and enhance songs virtually. Find out more about Razoo at razoo.io today.
Alex, earlier today, CNN is reporting that, trying to get a sense of Prigozhin's whereabouts, has been tricky. The State Department can't locate him. From where you stand in terms of coverage and such, what seems most likely is there, and you mentioned before that Belarus has a very close relationship with Russia. Is this a situation where Putin is potentially almost putting essentially a glass jar around Prigozhin to be able to monitor his actions, or is this truly an independent effort by Prigozhin to avoid to basically just keep safe distance from Putin for fear of what seems to happen to a lot of dissenters or those who go against the Russian government?
Yeah, I mean, wherever Prigozhin goes, I suspect he'll be looking for a ground floor apartment. We can definitely say that. But look, nobody knows where Prigozhin is right now. There's no evidence that he's actually in Belarus. I would guess that he's somewhere in southern Russia near this city Rostov, or he's back in eastern Ukraine, where a lot of his guys have gone. The question of what Putin does with Prigozhin is a really big and important one. I mean, to allow a guy to make a challenge like that to, basically a dictator. I mean, this is, every strongman's worst nightmare is that the aura of invincibility suddenly starts to evaporate, right? The emperor suddenly has no clothes. And there's no faster way for a guy like Putin to be shown to have no clothes than a private military contractor leads 10,000 guys towards Moscow and makes him blink, right? So there's a big question about what he does with Prigozhin. On the other side of it, though, and this is an interesting question, is why did Prigozhin think he could get away with this? And why didn't Putin just kill him straight off the bat? Why didn't he, attack that column of guys on Saturday morning when it was moving towards Moscow? And I think there's two reasons why Prigozhin calculated that he had enough juice to at least survive this initial challenge to the Kremlin. And one is, he's got a lot of guys under arms, right? He's commanding 25,000 battle-hardened guys. And I promised you I would tell you a little more about them. These guys are completely nuts. I mean, these guys are like mercenaries. A lot of them are from the prisons. The deal was you can get out of prison early if you agree to join this, crazy militia paramilitary group. A ton of white supremacists and neo-Nazis in the group. I mean, really sick guys. Like what they're one of their favorite routines is to capture people who they think of as traitors to Russia and smash their heads open against cement blocks with sledgehammers on video. I mean, these guys are practically the ISIS of Russia, right? So let there be no illusion that just because Prigozhin was challenging Putin that he's somehow, a great liberal reformer who wants to, wants the doves to cry and have good relations with the West. If anything, Prigozhin is angry because Putin is not prosecuting the war severely enough. But anyway, back to the reasons why he has power. One is that he has all these guys under arms, and 25,000 guys, reasonably heavily armed, is not nothing. And second, his politics are appealing to a lot of people. And what his politics are is he's kind of set himself up as this populist, nationalist man of the forgotten military grunt, right? He speaks on behalf of all of us guys in the trenches, fighting for Mother Russia, giving our blood, giving our lives, doing all this stuff while these corrupt scumbags in Moscow are mismanaging the whole thing, trying to cut us off and squandering the greatest army in the world, which is the Russian army and its helpers in Wagner Group. That's a message that appeals a lot to two groups that Putin does not want to have a problem with. One is lower and mid-ranking guys, rank and file guys in the security services and the army. You can bet that there are a lot of people who feel exactly the way Yevgeny Prigozhin feels when he says that stuff, because they're eating shit in the trenches. They don't have enough bullets. They don't have enough artillery. The logistics are terrible. Their commanders are all drunk. They're stealing all the cars. Like, it's not going well. So if you're a guy who's like there fighting, this war, this invasion that you're fighting against this tremendous resistance. You don't know why the hell you're there. Everyone is an idiot. It's going terribly. You're receptive to the idea that this guy's, telling your dickhead boss that he's screwing your life up, right? By doing this, right? That's a message we can all relate to, right? So Prigozhin has a lot of support, and his message resonates with those people. It also resonates with Putin's biggest critics in Russia, who are not, again, Western funded NGO civil society types. Those people are all dead or in exile. The people that Putin is worried about in Russia are the people who are even more hardcore than he is. The ultra hardcore nationalists who are like, why aren't we nuking Ukraine already? Why aren't we just completely leveling Kiev with cruise missiles and just destroying these people? Those are the people that Putin is really worried about, and those are the people that Prigozhin is a hero to. So he has to be really careful what he does with this guy. If he kills him, he creates a martyr for absolutely the wrong crowd that he doesn't want to have a problem with.
In my best Mickey Rourke Iron Man 2 voice, Yevgeny Prigozhin. I just love hearing Alex say some of these Russian names. Let's get to a boring name though first, Alex. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said something recently on CNN State of the Union that I wanted to play for you and get your reaction on the other side, because you talked a little bit about Putin maybe losing his grip here. And I want you to hear what the Secretary of State said. We'll get reaction on the other side. Take a listen to this.
This is a moving picture, and we haven't seen the last act yet. But we can say this. First of all, what we've seen is extraordinary, and I think you've seen cracks emerge that that weren't there before. First, in having Prigozhin raise front and center, questioning the very premises of the Russian aggression against Ukraine to begin with. The argument that somehow Ukraine or NATO posed a threat to Russia, and a direct challenge to Putin himself. So think about it this way. 16 months ago, Russian forces were on the doorstep of Kyiv, Ukraine, thinking they were going to take the city in a matter of days, erase the country from the map. Now, they had to be focused on defending Moscow, Russia's capital.
You hear that, and we've talked about, and now there's this existential question, of Putin's reign, right? You just mentioned some of the crazies that he's trying to talk off the ledge. You can't do anything with Yevgeny in terms of killing him, right, and making him a martyr. What do you make of not only what Antony Blinken said there, but Putin's reign, the first challenge of this kind in the decades plus that he's been in power? Like, what are we to make of that as a Western nation watching this unfold?
Well, two things. One, it is certainly the biggest challenge that Putin has faced. And, you know, as I was saying earlier, the key for being a strong man is that people have to believe that you are that you cannot be challenged, right? The second you open that box, you open that space, which says, hey, maybe this guy is slipping a little bit, that can metastasize very quickly, right? Because so much of the strong man's power is basically an illusion of invincibility, right? So that, I think, has been a little bit shaken with Putin. You know, from the perspective of an outsider, first of all, I sort of disagree with the character. I mean, Blinken sort of characterized Prigozhin as a guy who, you know, criticized the reason for the invasion and made it sound like Prigozhin is some kind of peacenik, which he's certainly not. His comments about the cause for the invasion are taken a little out of context. His view is basically that it was right to bring the Ukrainians to heel, but that Putin, guided by his idiot advisors, went about it in the wrong way, used the wrong pretext, empowered the wrong people, and basically made a hash of the whole thing. So it's important to be clear that Prigozhin is not a guy who wants to end the war in Ukraine. He would probably like to wipe Ukraine off the map sooner rather than later. The second thing about how the West views this, you know, when all this was going on Saturday, there was a lot of people sort of you know, openly rooting for the idea of a civil war in Russia, which, given how, you know, some of the horrible things that Vladimir Putin has done, is sort of appealing, right? You'd like to see the back of this guy. You'd like to see him end up the way Gaddafi did. The problem with that is that you've got to be really careful if you allow or watch Russia to turn into a basket case, right? This is not a country that you want to be in a state of prolonged instability or uncertainty about who's actually controlling things. This is the largest country by land mass in the world, borders with China, has the largest nuclear arsenal in the world, biological weapons, chemical weapons, you name it. This is not a country that you want to be a basket case. So I think, you know, I think the U.S. obviously played this well. They said, hey, this is an internal affair for the Russians to sort out. Certainly didn't seem to be pushing it in one way or the other that we know of. But I just think that's worth restating, like, and being really clear about that. It might be good to see the end of Vladimir Putin one day, but, you know, in a country where a guy like Yevgeny Prigozhin seems like the only person who has a chance of challenging him, / you might fall into some horrible civil war, it's not a great outcome.
Alex, before I get to my question, it's funny because I draw a parallel to what you just said with the death of Saddam Hussein and what we think about with the onset of ISIS in the Middle East. And it's an interesting parallel there about, like, you know, the devil you know, right, versus what you don't. When you we've been talking a lot about just reporting, like what you're experiencing. Obviously, we trust you greatly, and we ask we want our, you know, listeners to do the same. What's been your assessment about the information and coverage that's been coming out over the weekend? Obviously, we're all getting it from different places. I just basically continue to follow just a lot of trusted folks on Twitter, but it was interesting to see how many people would put out statements and people just ate it up. Like, there was very little time where people would say, "You sure about this?" Like, I could count maybe on one finger the number of times I saw a particular person say, well, let's pump the brakes because this is a part of the world where, and Alex, to your credit, when you first came on this show, you brought that up, that with the lack of independent media in Russia, you have to be very wary about the information coming out. So in your estimation, what's been reported fairly, what's perhaps been reported egregiously or just incorrectly or overemphasized to a point that we need to really put that under a microscope further?
Well, look, it's not just that there's no independent reporting or very little independent reporting left in Russia. It's also that you're dealing with two actors here who are absolute masters of the strategic constant lie. I mean, these are, this is, when you're dealing with the Russian government and this, crazy warlord, I mean, these are not, reliable narrators in any conceivable sense. Look, I think that the biggest problem is figuring out who's where, right? I think that was one of the biggest things. People say, oh, these guys are on the move. They're near Rostov. We've seen some videos that show them moving through the city. Are they not? Like, it took time to figure out where people actually were. And the story, these guys were moving pretty quickly. I think also, and we still don't know where a lot of these people are, right? Like your earlier question, we don't know where Prigozhin is right now, right? We don't know for sure where a lot of those Wagner guys are. There was a time when we didn't know where Putin was. There was a rumor, had he flown off to St. Petersburg? Was he in the Kremlin? So just figuring out who was where was really confusing. And I think also on the analytical front, I think people, as you say, we're jumping to conclusions about what it meant or what was happening based on statements or developments that were not necessarily, not that they weren't true, because they were happening, but that they weren't really the final say at all, right? Like, for example, Putin's press secretary, Dmitry Peskov, came out on Saturday and said, okay, we've reached a deal. The deal is the following thing, that, Prigozhin won't be charged. We're going to drop the treason charges against him. He was charged with treason, by the way, while this was all going on. So we're going to drop the treason charges, and we're going to offer a deal where he can go to Belarus and the Wagner guys can sign up with the defense ministry, or they can go home, and that's the deal. And everyone said, oh, okay, it looks like this thing is over. Wow, that's crazy. Look at this deal they reached. And like, it's 3 days later, and there's still no sense of whether that's actually the deal or not. Like, Prigozhin hasn't said anything to that effect at all. All he said about the deal is, we reached a deal under which Wagner Group can continue to operate in a legal framework, whatever that means, right? Then the Russian government media sources are saying, Russian state media today were emphasizing that no, actually, he still is being investigated and prosecuted for treason, and so like a lot of stuff is just so up in the air that it's hard to. I think it's foolish to try to reach definitive conclusions. I think the best thing you can do is try and set a context, right? This is the kind of world in which we're operating. This is what this sort of thing might mean for a guy like Putin. But, I think we're still in the early part of this saga.
There's nobody better to break down everything that's happening on that side of the world than our buddy Alex Kliment over at GZERO Media. You can check out all his work at gzeromedia.com. Sign up for the newsletter that he does, the Puppet Regime show that he does. Go follow him on social media, Twitter, Instagram. There's probably a bunch more accounts. Go listen to him do Russian accents. He probably does them for Babbel and some of these other places. Alex, you're the best, buddy. You always have a home here on Can We Please Talk to kind of break down all of these topics and issues. Continue success, my friend. Stay safe.
I appreciate it. Thank you. Good to be with you guys.
Hey, thanks for watching the Can We Please Talk podcast. Whatever clip you just watched, we hope you enjoyed it. And we hope you stick around for some more. Subscribe to the channel. My partner's over here smashing the button. Come on, do him a favor. So hit subscribe.